Today we're talking about the answer to the greatest philosophical question of all time. And this is probably one of the most important videos that I have ever done. Now, I was saving this to be released in my book that I'm currently working on. However, I have gotten so many questions about this topic in the past few months that I have decided that it's better to put it out right now, this particular piece and portion. Now, as we do, we're talking about something that is extremely complex, and there are pages and pages devoted to explaining this in my book. Many pages. An entire section is devoted to explaining this. So please keep in mind that as we go forward, we are talking about something that is at the very boundary of thought, and I am attempting to do so in a live stream, which is something that an entire section of my book is devoted to. So keep that in mind, that it is an enormous task to do such a thing in a live stream. I also want to put forward that the answer to this question is both extremely simple and extremely difficult. It is one of the most simple answers ever, but it's also one of the most difficult for people to understand because we are going to be dealing at the very boundary of thought with things that cannot be imagined. So, what are we talking about? What is the greatest question in philosophy? What is the greatest philosophical question of all time? And that is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why? And for those of you who are familiar with hyperianism, you might, oh, well, I know the answer to that. I'm going to be putting it in different terms that you have not heard before. So the question is, why is there something rather than nothing? And what that means is, the question is, how are we here? Why are we here? Why isn't there just absolutely nothing at all? Why is there anything at all, rather than just absolute nothingness? This is the greatest question, philosophical question of all time, and philosophers have been struggling with this, and it's been for years and years and years. Now, I want to make something clear, though. It's important that we put this in the correct terms, because the question that's really being asked, rather than why is there something rather than nothing, is why is there existence rather than non-existence? So let's put it in those terms, because one can argue the definitions between nothing and something. One can argue those. One can define nothing in a certain way. One can define something in a certain way. So instead of getting bogged down by the semantics of that, we're going to look at why is there existence rather than non-existence. Non-existence being the complete and total absence of everything, and existence being, that which is not non-existence. And so let's take a look at this. Now, to understand the answer to this question, we have to look at the principle of sufficient reason. And this is an extremely simple principle, a very simple principle. And the reason why we have to take a look at this, in addition to being the most simple principle, it's also very hard for people to understand, but it's really simple. So the reason why we're looking at the principle of sufficient reason is because the principle of sufficient reason is, and if you're familiar with hyperianism, you'll know that once the principle of sufficient reason is established, we can derive all reality. Meaning that given that the principle of sufficient is true, we can then use the principle of sufficient reason to show how existence is the way that it is. Because once we have the principle of sufficient reason, we can show the existence of ontological zero. We can show the existence of all possible mathematical configurations within zero, how this results in sinusoidal waves, and then how sinusoidal waves via Fourier mathematics can be used to build the material universe and facilitate the interaction of mind and matter. So what this means is that the PSR is the bedrock of hyperianism, the bedrock of our system, and given that that's true, we can derive existence. However, a lot of people ask, well, what is the reason for the principle of sufficient reason? Or how do you know that the principle of sufficient reason is true? And there are answers that can be given to that. And they're not wrong answers. They are correct answers. However, there is something with each of them that I find to be a little not completely satisfying. So I'm going to be showing you specifically the reason for the principle of sufficient reason, or at least when I say this, what I mean is how we know that the principle of sufficient reason exists. And once we know that the principle of sufficient reason exists, we can derive all reality. Because a lot of people who come to hyperianism go, okay, I get it, but how do we know that the principle of sufficient reason is true? And that's extremely important. So before diving into that, I'm going to explain a quick, because I know a lot of people coming to my channel may not be familiar with hyperianism and maybe want to know the answer to the greatest philosophical question of all time. Why is there existence rather than non-existence? And to be able to understand this, you have to know what the principle of sufficient reason is. So let me give you a quick crash course on the principle of sufficient reason. And so I'm going to be taking a look at some of my notes from my upcoming book here. And again, the principle of sufficient reason is an extremely simple principle, extremely simple, but it's very hard for people to understand. So let me just start to explain it. So to understand the principle of sufficient reason, we have to understand what we mean by reason. And we can think of reason as an explanation of some event or action. So when a ball rolls across the table and someone asks how the ball began rolling, I can give the reason or explanation. And, let's say it's because it's rolling because another ball hit it. So you see that if we have something that is occurring, something that is, a reason must be provided why it is that way. So, for example, if a ball is rolling across the table, you want to ask why or how or what's the explanation for the ball rolling across the table. And, it might be because, someone pushed it or another ball hit it. There is some reason, though, that ball is rolling. It's not rolling for absolutely no reason whatsoever. It's not just doing it magically or randomly. There is a reason that it is rolling in the way that it is. And so what the principle of sufficient reason is the principle that says for everything that exists, there must be a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise. What basically that means is that for anything that is, there has to be for some reason why it is that way. And it's a very simple principle. It's nothing super complicated. It basically just means you can't have miracles. You can't have things happening randomly for no reason at all. For everything that there is, there has to be some valid explanation for it. And so when one says, well, there has to be a reason for everything that is, it's important to understand we're talking about reason in the form of accounting for something's existence and not in some meaningful way. Right? Some people get confused. And when I say that the principle of sufficient reason means that everything has a reason for its existence, people think that sometimes that means that there's some sort of meaning behind everything. Like, oh, I missed my bus today. And the reason for that was because I actually ran into my future life partner when I went to the coffee shop to get a coffee to wait for the next bus. That's not what we mean by the principle of sufficient reason. That's not what we mean by everything having a reason. Not that there's some meaningful content to it, but that there is a reason in the form of why the state of affairs are the way that they are. Okay? So just to go a little further on that, and remember, this is very important for understanding why there is existence rather than non-existence. And remember, this is the greatest philosophical question of all time. So this is all going to come together, and it is absolutely critically important. So let me just go into it a little more here. So when a ball rolls across the table and someone asks me how the ball began rolling, I can give a reason or explanation. Let's say it's because another ball hit it. But if I said that the ball was moving because God caused it to move, well, that's not an adequate explanation. Because if no reason exists to explain how God could move the ball and how God could exist, then this explanation is irrational. And so do you see what I mean there? If the ball is rolling and someone says, well, how is that ball rolling? And I say, well, because God is making it roll. that is a violation of the principle of sufficient reason, because you would have to be able to give a rational mechanism into how God could be making that ball roll and how God could exist. So for all the explanations that you give, you also have to make sure that the thing that is the explanation is itself rational. And again, by rational, it doesn't mean that it has to be physical. It doesn't mean it has to be, like an empirical science explanation. It doesn't mean that. It just means that it has to be rational. It can't be irrational. So, simply stated, the principle of sufficient reason states that for any action, event, or thing, there must be a valid explanation for how that action, event, or thing came to be such that the explanation given also has a valid explanation. So, for example, in my explanation that the first ball was moving because the second ball hit it, an explanation exists for how the second ball was moving. Maybe I pushed the second ball. Now, this is not the case in the explanation that God moved the ball. That violates the principle of sufficient reason, because no explanation exists that's valid according to the principle of sufficient reason of how God could move the ball or how God could exist. So do you see the difference here? And it's very important to understand the difference. If the ball is moving and I say it's moving because the second ball hit it, I can give an explanation for that second ball moving. Well, it's because someone else, let's say someone pushed it. But that is not the case for if I say, well, God moved the first ball. Well, how? How did God move the first ball? By what mechanism or what process? And how does God exist? And if you just go, well, you see it's not valid. So the PSR has been used by Anaximander, Plato, Aristotle, and best articulated by the philosopher Leibniz. So Leibniz defined the principle of sufficient reason as follows: for everything that exists, there exists a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise. And to put it simply, in other words, for everything that exists, there exists a sufficient reason for why it is the way that it is instead of some other way. So this is, I could go on and on and on about giving examples and talking more about the principle of sufficient reason, but we're going to move on because that's just laying down the foundations for what we have to explain here today. And again, it's a very simple principle, but a lot people have a really hard time with it. They're not used to thinking in these terms. But, if you ever get confused or bogged down, don't try and overcomplicate it. It's a very simple principle. It just means that everything that exists has to have a rational explanation for how it can exist in the way that it does. It means you can't use magic or miracles or randomness or anything that violates the PSR to explain something. It doesn't have to be a mundane answer. It doesn't have to be like a materialist empirical answer. It can be as long as it's a rational answer that does not violate the PSR. So the reason why that we have established this and are discussing the principle of sufficient reason, because once the principle of sufficient reason is given, once we know that the principle of sufficient reason is true, we can derive existence from that principle. We can derive all existence. And this will be the answer to the question of, well, why is there existence rather than non-existence? Except what we want to do, and like I said, this is a question I've been getting a lot in the last couple months. And the reason why I'm doing this video, and it's very important, and I was saving this, for my book because it's a very long section, and there's a lot of little details that go into it, but I'm not sure when that's going to be out. So what we want to do is establish how we know the principle of sufficient reason exists. Because we know that once we have the principle of sufficient reason, we can derive all of existence and explain why there is existence rather than non-existence. But then the question becomes of, well, how do we know that the principle of sufficient reason itself exists? So real quick, if you're not familiar with hyperianism, I'm going to give you, or ontological mathematics, I'm going to give you a quick rundown, very, very fast, of why the principle of sufficient reason, once that we know that it exists, can derive the rest of reality. Now, and then after that, I'm going to show you how we know that the principle of sufficient reason exists. And we have given explanations for this before, and they're fine. They're good explanations. But this is one that I have not heard of before. For as far as I know, this is the first time that it's being put forward. So I'm putting it forward here because I feel like, for myself, and I think a lot of people will also agree, that it's a much more satisfactory, it's a more satisfactory explanation. Not that the other ones are wrong. They're not wrong. They are correct. But this one is more satisfying in my opinion. And I didn't want to wait for the book to come out because, like I said, a lot of people are asking this question. And I think the reason why they're asking it so much is because they're finding the other ones not particularly satisfying, or they're having a hard time understanding what it means. Again, they're not wrong. They're correct. But anyway, so let me first just give you a crash course on why, once we know the PSR, we can derive the rest of existence. And then I'll show how we can know that the PSR exists and why we have existence rather than non-existence, and answer the greatest philosophical question of all time. Yeah, it's exciting. So how we know this is basically once you have the principle of sufficient reason, which is just the law. It says, well, reality behaves rational. For everything that there is, there has to be a sufficient reason for why it is the way that it is and not another way. So basically, once we have the principle of sufficient reason, we get automatically from that all rational laws of thought, because all of them are in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason. So, for example, like a thing is what it is, like X is X. That is a logical statement that is rationally true and valid by the PSR. So once the PSR is established, you get the rational laws of existence. And, these are a priori and analytic truths. And all of these are valid by the PSR. So basically what this means is once you know that the PSR is true, from that, you get all the valid rational laws, all rational laws that are compatible with the PSR, you automatically get them as well because they don't violate the principle of sufficient reason. Why that's important is because you get the laws of mathematics with that. Because the laws of mathematics, now I want to just say a caveat, it's a very specific kind of mathematics called called ontological mathematics, which is basically just the way mathematics behaves ontologically in accordance with the PSR. But if you don't know what that means, that's okay, because I'm doing this very quickly, and this is something that would take an entire course to discuss. Once you have the PSR, you have all the laws of mathematics because they're valid by the PSR. So, for example, 2 + 2 = 4. That's a valid statement by the PSR. There is nothing irrational about that. It is rationally, logically, it is perfect. There's nothing inconsistent. There's no issues with it. So it's important to understand that once you have the PSR, you have with it all the laws of rational thought and all the laws of mathematics. Now, to understand this in a more simple and intuitive way, let's put it this way. If you have the principle of sufficient reason, you can have the concept of zero, because the concept of zero is nothingness. So zero and nothingness is valid by the PSR, well, because it's perfectly nothing. Zero exists because it's nothing and because it needs nothing. So zero has within it the reason for its own existence. And there's no problem with that. That's perfectly fine. The reason can come from within itself as long as it's valid by the PSR. So why does zero exist? How does zero exist? How can zero exist? Well, because it's nothing and nothing needs anything. You don't need anything. What I mean by you don't need anything is you don't need anything external. It doesn't require, let's say, material atoms. You don't need material atoms to construct zero. Zero is completely and totally self-contained, and it doesn't need anything external. So zero can exist by the principle of sufficient reason. Now, mathematically, once you have zero, you can also have a complete set of mathematics. And the reason why that is true is because if you can equate zero to all values. Because if you equate zero to all values, all positive values and all negative values become zero, right? If you were to add up if you were to sum all positive and negative values in a perfectly balanced way, it would add up to zero. It would equal zero. So what this means, and once you have zero, you also have all of mathematics that are such that it is equivalent to zero. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, it's a really simple concept. If you have 0, 0 is equal to all values, because you have all positive values, all negative values, and they ultimately resolve to 0. So you see 0 has the reason for itself within itself, in that it's perfectly nothing, and it doesn't need anything external, doesn't need like material atoms or anything like that. And what it allows for is a complete and consistent set of mathematics, being that complete and consistent set ultimately sums to or nets to 0. Okay, so far we have the PSR, which results in 0, which results in all of mathematics that are valid and compatible with 0 in the PSR. And I'm going to have to skip quite a bit because, again, time constraints. But what we can show is that this set of mathematics is arranged in such a way that is rational and that is valid by 0 and valid by the PSR, that it forms sinusoidal waves. This is because it can form the configuration of a circle, and a circle centered at the origin is equal to 0, and a circle centered at the origin equivalent to 0 is also equal to sinusoidal waves. When you have a circle, you automatically have sine and cosine waves. And because one circle is possible, you can have a vast multiplicity of circles possible because they're all equivalent to 0. And so since you have a vast multiplicity of circles, this is a vast multiplicity of zeros, which means a vast multiplicity of sinusoidal waves. So you have the PSR that results in 0, that results in mathematics, that results in a cyclical pattern, that results in sinusoidal waveforms. Now, these sinusoidal waveforms form a basis set in what's known as Fourier mathematics. And Fourier mathematics is just a way of how we can mathematically manipulate sinusoidal waves, sines and cosines. All Fourier mathematics does is it shows how to add sines and cosines together. And so, in essence, and it's very important to signal processing, quantum mechanics, electrical engineering, image processing, it's used everywhere. And again, it's about adding sinusoids together. So we can explore the result of adding sinusoids together. And essentially what this means is that when we add sinusoids together, we can start to get functions. Instead of just being in terms of pure frequency, we can get functions in terms of space and time by introducing phase into these sinusoidal waves. So ultimately, what this means, because again, I could talk for hours about this, I'm trying to make it short. Once you have sinusoidal waves, you can it is mathematically possible to construct any wave structure that is physically realizable, no matter how complex it is, even if it's as complex as the universe itself. And we know that the universe is ultimately behaves like a wave-like structure. So what this means is once we have a vast multiplicity of sinusoids, we can use those sinusoids to construct the physical universe. Quote unquote, so-called physical universe. It's not actually physical. It's created by or arises from the interactions of these sinusoidal waves that are ultimately mined that all net total to 0. So you have the PSR that results in 0, that results in the laws of mathematics, that results in the cyclical pattern, that results in sinusoidal waves, and you have a vast multiplicity of them because you can have a myriad of zeros. And then by combining them together, you can form a complex wave structure as complicated as it could ever possibly be, and it is as complicated as the universe itself because it is the universe itself. So that is a very, again, you probably have, if you've never heard this before, you probably have many questions. You can find them in other material, but not, I'm not going to go into it right now because, it would take way too long. I have written books. I have written a book on ontological mathematics. The philosophers Mike Hockney and Dr. Stark has written great books on ontological mathematics, and I am currently writing a book on hyperianism, and a section will be on everything that we're talking about today, and in so much greater detail. But if you want, it's still in books and videos that you can find. So here's the thing. All right. So we have established that if granted the PSR, we can derive all existence. And the biggest question in philosophy is, well, why is there existence rather than non-existence? So then the question turns to, and this question comes up very often for people who are new to hyperianism and new to ontological mathematics. They go, well, the principle of sufficient reason says that for everything that exists, there must be a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise. Well, what is the sufficient reason for the principle of sufficient reason? Or how do we know that the principle of sufficient reason exists? Because if the principle of sufficient reason exists, sure, we can derive all reality, but what about the principle of sufficient reason itself? How do we know that that exists? And this is the crux of the issue. This is what it all comes down to. This is the bedrock. This is the foundation. And this is where you get the answer to why there is existence rather than non-existence. Now, answers to this have been given. And there are 3 answers that have been given. And they are not correct. There's nothing wrong with these answers. They are fine. I just personally don't find them totally 100% satisfactory. They work and they're great explanations, but I'm going to, show you a different one today. But let me just go over with the ones that have been provided, because they're fine explanations. So, the first that is sometimes given is that the principle of sufficient reason is an axiom. And that's it. There's nothing wrong with that. You can claim that you can claim the principle of sufficient reason as an axiom. You can just claim that it is true. So if you're building a philosophical system based on reason, you can start off with an axiom. And if that axiom is, logically consistent, rationally consistent, and gives rise to all reality, well, there's nothing wrong with that. But to me, that's not satisfactory. It's not incorrect. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's a difference between something being correct and then something having, sort of having that satisfactory, okay, like that resolves, there's still, I am satisfied. So there's nothing wrong with claiming it as an axiom. I think there's a more satisfactory way to go about it. The second way, which is a great way, is to show that asking for the principle of sufficient reason implies the existence of the principle of sufficient reason. So what this means is, someone comes up to you and says, hey, I want to know the answer to the principle of sufficient reason. Let me make sure that I'm still streaming here and that I haven't, lost connection or anything like that. Yeah, okay, good. Because I want to make sure this is actually being recorded here. Okay, so the second one is asking for the reason for the principle of sufficient reason is to implicitly affirm it, meaning that the principle of sufficient reason is self-affirming. So what this means is if someone comes up to you and says, hey, that's all well and good, but I want you to tell me what the reason is for the principle of sufficient reason. Well, what you do then is you show this person that, well, by asking me for a reason for the principle of sufficient reason, you're affirming that the principle of sufficient reason must be true. Because the principle of sufficient reason is the very principle that says that everything has to have a reason. So by you asking me the reason for the principle of sufficient reason, you're affirming its truth. Because if you were to claim that the principle of sufficient reason is not true, then no explanation would be needed. You would not be asking me for a reason for it, because reasons wouldn't matter to you if the principle of sufficient reason did not exist. So by engaging in the very process of asking for a reason for something, you have affirmed the existence of the principle of sufficient reason. You can't have a truly rational discussion without affirming the principle of sufficient reason. Because if you don't enter into a discussion by affirming the principle of sufficient reason, you can just say whatever you want because there's no principle guiding it. You can just make claims. And that would be fine if you're denying the principle. So any form of asking for someone to provide a reason for the PSR and engaging in a rational discussion implicitly affirms its existence. So that's the second way that one can show the existence of the PSR. And again, there's nothing wrong with it. That's a good explanation. I think think that that's quite a great one. It's very good. But again, I think there's a more satisfying way. And so let's move on to the third way that it is explained, and then I will show you a different way here and now. But real quick, before I do, I have to use the bathroom. because it's very distracting to be talking about these philosophical concepts on a full bladder. We're talking about how we can know that the PSR exists. And we've looked at two ways so far. That one can claim it as an axiom, or one can show that it is self-affirming if one requests a reason for the principle of sufficient reason. Now, the third way that it can be shown the principle of sufficient reason is true is by showing that the principle of sufficient reason is equivalent to ontological zero, and then showing why zero must exist. So what this basically means is that the principle of sufficient reason mathematically is equivalent to zero, because zero is a state of nothingness that requires everything to be in perfect rational balance. So, of course, the principle of sufficient reason, there's no magic paper floating in the void, inscrawled upon it. The principle of sufficient reason. For everything that exists, there must be a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise. Obviously not. Ontologically, what the principle of sufficient reason is, mathematically, is zero. So if we understand that the principle of sufficient reason is the concept of zero, then we can give a reason for the existence of zero. So, and we've already done so, and I've discussed that. Zero has the reason for its existence within itself. The reason for the existence of zero is because zero needs nothing to exist. It is perfectly nothing and requires nothing. Now, that doesn't mean it's not full. It is full. It is rationally and logically full and rationally and logically consistent. And it has the reason for its own being within itself. And that's important. Because if some people think that there's a problem with that, there's no problem with that. That's necessary. If you're looking for the answer to the existence, the thing that explains reality has to have the answer to itself within itself. If it comes from anything external, then you get infinite regress, because then that external thing would have to be explained. And then the thing that was external to that thing would have to be explained, and on and on and on and on and on. You get infinite regress. The thing that is the answer to existence must have its own reason for being within itself. As long as it's rational, as long as it's valid, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as it has a sufficient reason, it can be within itself. That's okay. As long as it's valid and compatible. So if one shows and that the PSR is ontological zero, then one can say, well, the reason for being of zero, that's easy to show. That the reason for being of zero is that it's perfectly nothing, and requires nothing for its existence, and so it is, and it is eternal. It's not something that's created. It's not something that arises. It is a rational concept that is and always will be, because it's perfectly and totally nothing. Nothing is not something that you can, create, and nothing is not something that you can destroy. For an intuitive way to understand that, think about how would you make nothingness? You can't. How would you, destroy nothingness? You can. It's nothing. Now, that's not a rigorous proof or anything like that. That's just, and it is not correct. It's not like super accurate, but it's to give you sort of an intuitive idea for people who are coming to these ideas for the first time. So that is the third way to account for the principle of sufficient reason, which is showing that the PSR is ontologically zero and then giving a reason for zero. And I like that one a lot. It's really, really good. It's one of my favorites, and it's true, right? There's nothing wrong with it, and it is true. The only thing that I find not totally satisfactory about this is that I think some people have a hard time understanding the leap between the PSR and it being zero. There isn't a leap, and it is. It's just I think it's hard for people to understand. Because they're not used to thinking in terms of mathematical ontology. So there's nothing wrong with it. I just think some people have a hard time understanding it. And then the other thing, though, that I think is that I find one portion of it to not be completely satisfactory is thus. It shows that the PSR and zero exists, but it's not totally obvious why that it is mandatory or must or has to exist. And that's a little confusing, because zero does have to exist. It's nothingness. It can't not exist. It's nothing. But what I mean by that is one could sort of try to imagine a universe in where there was just non-existence. Like imagine that. Imagine total non-existence without zero at all. I'm going to show that you can't do this, but if you're new to this, one would think that, that might be possible. And so it's a very, very good explanation. But I think rather than showing why the PSR can exist as ontological zero, we're going to move on to now this explanation. And this is the one that, in my opinion, is the best and most satisfactory. And this is to show, because remember, the whole question is, why is there existence rather than non-existence? And again, this is going to be at the very boundary of thought, because we're going to be dealing with things that cannot be conceptualized, such as the concept of the impossible. So why there is existence rather than non-existence is because non-existence is impossible. Non-existence contains within itself its own rational contradiction. So what I mean by that, like if you think of the concept of zero, the concept of zero contains within itself the reason for its own being. Non-existence contains within itself rational contradiction. And what I mean by that is, and we're going to unpack this, there's a lot to unpack here. And that is, you even think of the statement, non-existence exists. That itself is absurd. That is the statement that which does not exist exists. This is this is an absurd statement. It is not rationally coherent. Now let's break this down a little more. So imagine that, and again, this is a very simple explanation, but it's also one of the most complex explanations because we're dealing at the boundary of thought and people aren't used to thinking in these terms. So it's very, very simple, but it is also complex. And so let's kind of do a thought experiment. I want you to imagine that we're trying to figure out, why there is something rather than nothing, or why there is existence rather than non-existence. And usually you go to, you want to go back to the origin of the universe when there's absolutely nothing, right? Absolutely nothing at all. And then, if you're a Christian, you'll go, well, and then God created the world. But you gotta go, well, how does God exist? How is that possible? Or if you're a scientific materialist, you go, well, there was a Big Bang. Well, how did the Big Bang occur? And even if you try to claim like a quantum fluctuation or something like that, you have to account for that existence. And there's I don't want to get to the whole debate about what the Big Bang actually says, but ultimately, what I'm trying to get at here is that let's go back to, that origin point. And so I want you to, imagine absolutely nothing at all. Now you can't imagine this. It's impossible to imagine. If you're even just imagining, the best you can do is imagine darkness. But darkness is not non-existence. Darkness is, darkness for a long time is darkness for a long time. That's not non-existence. So you can't imagine non-existence. It is not darkness for a long time. That is not what non-existence is. But let's play pretend for a minute, and let's say that you can imagine that. So imagine non-existence. Now, if we're trying to think about the origin of the universe or whatnot, so you have this state of affairs in mind where there's just total non-existence. Now, what if I were to make the claim to you, well, there's also a banana or an orange or anything at all, a rock, like it could be anything, right? Let's say there's an orange, let's say. Well, you would probably object to that and go, well, what do you mean? There's an orange. Where did that orange come from? How could that orange exist? How is that possible? Like, we're trying to figure out, the origin of existence, and you just invoked this thing appearing, and do this thought experiment for yourself. I think you would find there to be a problem with that. If I were to claim that there was something like that there, say an orange, I think you would object and go, well, wait a minute, how is that possible? So here's the thing. What this means is, by imagining this state of total blankness, but then objecting to me claiming that something like that occurs, what you have done is affirmed the principle of sufficient reason, because you're asking for a reason for, well, how could that have happened? Right? So what I mean by this, why this is really critical and important, is because if you are attempting to imagine non-existence, and yet that claim bothers you, you aren't imagining non-existence because you are actually imagining a state of affairs where the PSR still exists. So what I mean is, if you're truly imagining non-existence, or attempting to, then you can't have the PSR exist. You have to also imagine that the PSR itself does not exist. Because we're saying non-existence is the total absence of everything, including the principle of sufficient reason. And if you're just imagining, darkness, and then I claim that a banana or something appears, and you say, hey, wait, you can't do that. You haven't truly imagined non-existence, because the PSR still exists in that thought experiment that we're doing. So to truly imagine non-existence, you must also eliminate the PSR. Because the whole point of this, right, is that we're going to establish the existence of the PSR. So you don't want to start off where the PSR already exists, right? So you go to the state of affairs where there is complete and total non-existence, including the non-existence of the PSR. Well, here's the problem. If you go to a state of affairs where the PSR does not exist, you still don't have non-existence. Because if you go to a state of affairs where the PSR does not exist, then there are no rational laws whatsoever, and then absolutely anything can happen. Chaos and randomness reigns. So the important thing to understand with this is that when the PSR doesn't exist, it's not just that a lot of implausible things can occur. It's that things that are literally impossible, absurdities that aren't possible in any way. I don't mean highly improbable or whatnot. I don't even mean something like, a banana appearing out of the sky for no reason at all. I mean statements like 2 + 2 = 97 in a base 10 numbering system, of course. Sorry, thank you, Jody. That just distracted me for a moment. I mean completely impossible statements. And by impossible statements, I mean statements that involve a logical contradiction. Now, to be more accurate, what's more accurate is to say that entails a rational contradiction. So without the PSR, statements that involve a rational contradiction would occur. Now, people understand more what a logical contradiction is, so I'm going to say logical contradiction, but know that to be accurate, I mean rational contradiction. So this is now where we have statements that entail a logical contradiction. So things like, X is not X. Or, 87 = 42. Just totally, a square is both a square and a triangle at the same time in Euclidean geometry. These are not just improbable, not just absurd. Well, they are, from the technical standpoint, they are literal impossibilities. They can't even be conceptualized. Like, you cannot conceptualize a square triangle. That's impossible in Euclidean geometry. You can't conceptualize that. You cannot conceptualize 2 + 2 = 64 in base 10 numbering system. You can't. You could write it down on a piece of paper. You could write down 2 + 2 = 64, but those are just symbols on paper that you have manipulated. That's not the actual concept. The actual concept is impossible. It cannot be actually conceptualized. It's literally impossible. You cannot conceptualize a square triangle. You cannot conceptualize 2 + 2 = 64. You could write these things on a piece of paper, and you could draw like a circle overlaid on a triangle or something like that, but you could not actually conceptualize something that is both, a thing that is both a triangle and a circle simultaneously in Euclidean geometry. Or, statements like a red rose is not a red rose, which in its logical form is just X is not X. So what I'm getting at here, and why this is very important, is to understand that if you are trying to imagine non-existence, you have to also imagine that the PSR does not exist. And if the PSR does not exist, you don't have non-existence, you have the impossible, which isn't possible, but if in our play, pretend thought experiment it were somehow, it's not. It's not. But if it were somehow, there wouldn't be non-existence, there would be absolute chaos. So non-existence is a complete and total 100% impossible state. If you imagine just blankness, it's not non-existence because you've affirmed the PSR. If you try to imagine a state of affairs without the PSR, it's still not non-existence because there would be chaos and absolute randomness occurring, not non-existence. Non-existence is a 100% impossible state that entails a logical contradiction. And you can get an understanding just by the concept itself. To the statement that non-existence exists is incoherent. That which does not exist exists is logically incoherent. So the flip side to this is what is logically coherent is that existence exists. This is very important. So do you see the difference? Versus non-existence exists is invalid and impossible. Existence exists. There's nothing formally wrong with this. It's valid. Existence exists. This is the exact opposite of non-existence exists. And why this is important is because what this ultimately ends up showing, and this is so simple but so complex at the same time, because you see how we're dealing at the boundaries of thought. You cannot conceptualize the impossible. You cannot conceptualize these statements. You can write them down, but you can't conceptualize them. But this is why we are at the very boundary of thought. And this shows two things: that non-existence is impossible and that the PSR is mandatory. Why does the PSR exist? Because the PSR prevents the impossible, and the impossible cannot exist. The PSR has to exist, and it is backed by that sufficient reason. That if the PSR did not exist, there would be the impossible, but the impossible, by definition, can't be. The PSR exists and must exist and has to exist, and the reason is because without it, if it did not, there would be the impossible, and that is impossible. What this means, and again, this is very, I know a lot of people are going to miss the importance of this, and this is critical. What this means is that existence cannot not exist. What we have, this state of affairs, this what we're experiencing, everything around us right now, is what has to be and must be. It's not just like, oh, wow, this is strange. I wonder who created it, or I wonder how it happened, or I wonder why there's something rather than nothing. That's weird. It's that it is literally not possible for there to be not this. Only this has to be. It must be. If it wasn't, then the impossible would be, but that is impossible. So this is what I sort of call the perfection and impossibility proof, because this is perfection, not perfection in that, there's a lot of imperfections in the world, right? Like there's a lot of, atrocities and stuff. That's not what I mean by perfection. What I mean by perfection is that there is no rational contradiction formally. There is no formal rational contradiction whatsoever. What exists is utterly, completely, and totally perfect in the formal rational sense. And that is all that there is, because it is all that can be, because literally nothing else is possible. Now, I don't mean it in the sense of like, oh, well, like this particular contingent configuration must be, the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you and there's a pen on the table and there's a world called Earth and a nation called America. I'm not saying that those contingent facts are have to be. I'm saying the concept and laws that give rise to existence itself, the fundamental laws, which is the PSR expressed, the fundamental laws are perfect and all that can be and all that must be. And the reason why I find why this is my favored explanation is because it shows that existence is mandatory and non-existence is impossible. And so it gets rid of that question of like, well, what if there was just absolutely nothing at all? Because you realize that that state of affairs is not a possible state of affairs, because that would mean that the PSR would not exist, and then there would not be non-existence, there would be chaos. But the impossible is literally impossible, so it cannot be. So and I'm going to, unpack this even more, because again, it's so simple. It's just the impossible is impossible and the possible is possible. Or that what can't be and what can be can be. What can't be isn't and what can be is. It's very, very simple, but it is critical. It is important that one totally and completely understands what this means and grasps its implications, because it answers the greatest philosophical question of all time. And again, it's not like there haven't been great answers for the PSR. They're awesome. Then there's nothing wrong with them. But this is important to understand the particular implications of the fact that non-existence is impossible. Entails logical contradiction. Non-existence can't exist. It's a logical contradiction. So what this means is, because it's very weird. If we start thinking about this in our subjective experience of reality, it's very odd to sort of be plopped into existence with all these things going on, YouTube, lights, trees, chairs, America and Europe. And, I'm just saying all the, you were born and just sort of plopped into all this. And at some point, if one is a thinker, they start to think of like, well, how can all of this be? What is all of this? Where am I? A lot of people don't even get to that. They just retain whatever they were born with. Like, oh, well, it was God. Or, oh, well, it was the Big Bang. Or it was Brahman or whatever. But if one is a, truly rational thinker, they start to, you start to question all this and go, this is very odd. Where am I? What's going on? What is this place? How did I get here? What is existence? What is any of this? And this is basically sort of the essence of philosophy. This is what philosophy is all about, answering this question, what's been going on for years and years. And the thing to grasp about this is that we are it. This is what we are. We are all that can be and all that is. What we are must exist. It can't not exist. We are perfect in the sense of being formally perfect. We are, if you want to say God, we are God. We are the all. We are the I am. You can have the whole I am that I am is really the what is. What can be, what must be. And so we are in this state of affairs where this is us, this is all of us, this is what we are, and we're all that can be eternally, and our existence of man is mandatory. We can never pull, we can never pull out, we can never escape, we can never hit the eject button, we can never exit, because it would be a violation of the of that would imply non-existence, and that is impossible. So this is it. This is where we are. This is where we have found ourselves, and what we have done as all that there is configured a game for ourselves. We have thrown ourselves into forgetfulness, generated this reality collectively, thrown ourselves into a multiplicity to experience ourselves as different and to have this experience. That's what we did. That's what we are. This is where we have found ourselves. And just even as a thought experiment, think about it. Imagine what it would be like to be all that there is, all that can be, and ever will be, and your existence is mandatory. What would you do? What would you do if that was you? Well, it is you, and this is what you did. What you did was you divided yourself into a multiplicity through a universal particularizing itself, and then generated a localized reality, a space-time environment with avatars to be able to experience you, us, ourselves together, localized in a form of in a form of multiplicity. This is the game that we play with ourselves as ourselves, because we are all there is and all that can be, and our existence is mandatory. Now, if this makes sense to you, great. If it doesn't, please watch this a few times. Let it really sink in. This is critical. This is important. To truly understand this is to understand the answer to all things, and to understand why we are here, where you are, what you are, why you're here. We have found ourselves in this game that we have been playing. And now is the time to realize that so we can start having fun. See, that's the thing. Because we've thrown ourselves into forgetfulness. Because, of course, if you remembered everything, it wouldn't be a fun game now, would it? It would be a very boring game if you did this, but then still remembered that it would be like you were sort of talking to yourself, because that's literally what we're doing. When I'm talking to you and you're talking to me, we're talking to ourselves. And if we retained all that information, well, the game wouldn't be fun anymore. It would just be like you playing the single player game all by yourself. It'd be like playing chess by yourself and you going back and forth and playing both. It would be boring. So we have been, thrown into this mode of forgetfulness. And there's a whole, I'm saying this in a very simplistic way, it has to do with evolution and survival and adaptation and all that. But simplistically, we have thrown ourselves into this forgetfulness. And what the part of the game that we're at right now is to remember this so that we can start to have fun and enjoy the game. And some might think, well, wait, isn't the whole point to forget? So if we remember, isn't that what we don't want to be doing? No, we want to, so that we're at the state. You see, this is the fun part of the game where we rediscover ourselves. You see, it's about throwing yourself into forgetfulness so that you have the thrill, because we've been experiencing ourselves in multiplicity for so long, in separateness and not knowing what the fuck is going on. But now is the time, the thrilling time, when we realize, hey, wait, this is all us. We can start building and constructing new worlds and new ideas and new concepts and new societies all based on this. We don't have to kill each other and fight and have racism and sexism and genderism and hatred and all this. We don't have to do that, because we realize, hey, we're all in this together. This is all us. Let's stop being assholes to each other and start really living and enjoying life and thriving. Because we're at that point where we're still in that mode of separation. But with the knowledge of what we are, we can enjoy the separation and the unity at the same time. Because we still have that compartmentalized mode of, I can have a conversation with you right now. I'm not sitting in your subjectivity. But with the knowledge of that we are that all that there is in that underlying unity, we can start to enjoy life and create new societies and new ways of living and new ways of doing things. And what I want to really stress about this is that, think about when humanity first started building civilization. When humanity started building civilization, to form complex civilizations, it required self-awareness. Imagine instinctual beings, right? Just purely instinctual beings that have no concept of self-awareness. They would not be able to create very complex societies, would they? No, they'd be pretty shit. It took a new form of consciousness, self-awareness, to build the complex society that we have here today now. Now, with this new knowledge and understanding of what we are, where we are, why we are here, and stepping into a new consciousness of hyper-awareness, we can build a new society that the self-aware, simply self-aware, can't and have no idea that can even exist. Just like an instinctual being wouldn't understand the concept of, walking around in a city and all the institutions that exist. It's beyond them. Hyper-awareness, this knowledge of what we are, that we are all that is, and the way reality is structured, allows us to create a new kind of society that unfolds in a way that is completely different than that it has ever came before it. Just like, you have maybe like primitive tribes compared to the modern civilization now, what we construct will be that different. Our Hyperion society compared to the society we have now would be akin to the society we have now compared to like the most rudimentary hunter-gatherer tribes you could think of. It's a completely new way of thinking. It's a completely new way of doing things. And this is where, this is going to be all in my book as well. What this requires, and the political section of this. This goes into detail on teleocracy, which is a purposeful society, a society guided, unified through purpose, based on principles of merit, equity, care, compassion, reason, consciousness, all these things together towards a purposeful society built towards the goal. Remember, we have a purpose, because societies don't have any fucking purposes right now except bullshit like increasing the GDP, the gross domestic product, and reducing the unemployment rate. Is that what you fucking think life is about? Like, look how bullshit this is. We are the all that is experiencing ourselves in multiplicity. And what do these fuckers do? They get in their really important suits and ties and start talking about the gross domestic product and unemployment rate and the economy and blah. Is that life? Is that what we fucking came here to do? This bureaucratic bullshit? No. Not at all. We came here to have a thriving, purposeful community, united as one, actualizing ourselves, having meaningful experiences, enjoying life, creating art, gaining knowledge, creating new things, creating each other, creating new worlds, creating an entire planetary civilization, and ultimately achieving planetary independence, where we don't even have to rely on the physical reality of the holos anymore. We've become so synchronized that we can create our own collective frequency domain and construct our own collective universe, our own collective frequency domain. So reality is that's why I get so fucking frustrated when you have, it's like having to live in a hunter-gatherer tribe. That's what it's akin to. Where we are right now, like having these fuckers taking away people's rights and, this racist, religious, awful, all this bullshit. And people thinking, oh, they're real super important with their ties, talking about the GDP and the economy and income and unemployment and all that fucking bullshit. If this were a true society, we wouldn't be complaining about the unemployment rate. We would be focused on automation so that no one would have to work and that all would remain our passion projects. In a new society, employment rate, where if it refers to menial jobs, would be a bad thing. We don't want higher employment rate if it comes to menial jobs. We want lower employment rate and automate those employment rates so that people can focus on passion projects and actualizing themselves and contributing to their growth and the growth of the world in ways where menial jobs don't even have to exist anymore. And of course, this would all be within a system of free housing, UBI, and free healthcare, all of it that goes to make that successful. Remember, this is an entirely new way of envisioning the world. Like, forget about how the world is right now. I don't even like to talk about it in terms of as though it's politics. It's not fucking politics. It is constructing a network of minds together, living in a unified collective so that we might maximize our individual and collective actualization and life satisfaction. Or you can talk about increasing the GDP. So dumb. Let's move away from that old archaic thinking. It's like tribal hunter-gatherer version of primitive bullshit, and step into a new way of imagining reality, because it all starts in the mind. If you imagine that it can't be done, it won't be done. Because no one's going to work towards it. If you think it can't happen, it won't happen, because then you won't work towards it and no one will work towards it. Every change begins with an idea in the mind. If you know that it can happen, because it can happen, it's not even a utopia, it should be obvious, then we will begin to construct it. We will begin to build it. So don't let those bullshitters tell you, oh, it can't happen, or that's a crazy pipe dream. No, that's fucking bullshit. It absolutely can happen. And it will happen. By our will, it will be done. Okay, so I'm going quite off topic here. And just to be, because this is very, very important. And just to be, because like I said, this is a simple yet complex topic. And I have pages, and I have an entire section devoted in my book to explaining this. And I tried to do so in a relatively short time on a live stream. And that's not, I can't do it complete justice doing that. Yeah, so another thing that I would like to, show is that this is also a proof by contradiction. Proof by contradiction basically shows if you deny something, it leads to a contradiction, thus shows that that thing must exist. So if you try to deny the principle of sufficient reason, what happens? You get impossibility. You go, basically, suppose the principle of sufficient reason does not exist. If the principle of sufficient reason does not exist, well, then the impossible would exist. Well, the impossible can't exist, and so the principle of sufficient reason must exist. And it's actually such a powerful idea that if let's say we're doing a proof, and you go, suppose the principle of sufficient reason does not exist, you literally couldn't continue. You couldn't do the proof because the proof relies on the principle of sufficient reason. So you just have to stop. So let me just... I'm going to read you a rough draft of a portion of this portion of my book, because like I said, I want to make sure that this is put forward as clear as I possibly can in the short time of a live stream. So if you were to begin at non-existence with absolutely nothing at all, that would mean that reason itself does not exist. Because if reason existed, it wouldn't be non-existence because something would exist, right? That's what we talked about before. If you go back to non-existence and you try to say that, well, reason, you'd have to say reason doesn't exist, or else there would be something and it wouldn't be non-existence. If you had non-existence and reason, it's not non-existence anymore, it's reason. But then if you have non-existence and remove reason, you don't have non-existence anymore, you have impossibility, which is impossible and cannot be. So if you start with non-existence, you would unleash the impossible. An infinity of paradoxes would occur. Non-existence cannot exist. And there are multiple ways to show this. You can clearly see even in the statement, non-existence exists entails a logical contradiction, which is an impossibility. Non-existence, the lack of existence, cannot exist. But it's deeper than that. Non-existence would mean that reason does not exist, and this is the greatest impossibility of all. So if non-existence, which includes the non-existence of reason, could exist, there still wouldn't be non-existence. Why? Because without reason, the floodgates of impossibility would be unleashed, and the most chaotic scenario you can possibly imagine, things popping in and out of existence, universes arising and being destroyed instantly, time reversing, beings flickering in and out of existence. A lot of things would be occurring that's not non-existence. But even that is not the impossible, because the impossible entails logical contradiction and you can't imagine it. You can imagine like universes popping in and out of existence. You can imagine all sorts of chaos, but you literally can't imagine the impossible. We went over that before when we were talking about the concept of like a square circle in Euclidean geometry, or 2 + 2 = 64 in base 10 numbering system. Okay, and this is an important point here as well. I just want to make sure I get all the major points. There's so much to dive into this, but I want to get into this. So some may object to this and claim that if reason didn't exist, then impossibility could exist, and that I'm implying the rules of reason in a scenario where reason doesn't exist. Now, if you have this objection, you haven't understood the point. My point is that a scenario where reason doesn't exist is utterly impossible. See, people will go, well, wait a minute, you're using reason to justify reason. Yes. And if you think there's something wrong with that, you haven't quite gotten the point. First of all, the thing that answers existence has to have its reason within itself, because if it were outside of itself, it wouldn't be the answer anymore. It would be something else, and you get infinite regress. So yes, reason justifies reason, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's how it must be. That's how it has to be. If it didn't, it's impossible for it to be any other way. But the point is that a scenario where reason doesn't exist is utterly impossible. We can't even directly discuss what it would be like because there's no such thing as what it would be like. We can only talk about it in an indirect way with substitute concepts like erratic behavior. It can never be the case that reason does not exist. Even in an imagined scenario, it is impossible for reason to not exist. Damn, there was an important point here that I was gonna say and I just forgot. What was it? Fuck. I remember. Okay, so you have to step outside of these, sort of a human way of looking at things, because people think. I think that's the biggest thing is people will be like, oh well, you're using reason to justify reason. And again, if you're objecting based on this, you haven't really understood the point. Again, reason must use itself to justify itself because the answer to existence has to answer itself, or else it wouldn't be the answer to existence. That should be obvious, but people have a really hard time with that. But if you think about it, it's true. Anything else would lead to infinite regress. The fact that it does so isn't a problem. It's a feature. It's a good thing. And also, people who object to this have to realize that the whole point is that there is no scenario where reason doesn't exist. And what I mean by that is, reality is a certain way. There are things that cannot be, and there are things that can be. What cannot be is what we have labeled the impossible. What can be and is what we call reason. So it's not as though we are trying to apply this human constructed concept of reason on top of what reality is. That's not what's happening. It's that reality is the way that it is, which is the only way that it can be and must be, and that's what we call reason. See the difference? Really important. This is not some human constructed paradigm that we're trying to apply on top of something. It is that reality is a certain way, and there's a way that reality cannot be. The way that reality cannot be is what we label as the impossible, and what reality is and must be is what we label with the human word reason. So it's really important to understand. If someone tries to make that former, the objection I mentioned, they have not understand what is being said. So the PSR is the self-grounding ground of existence. The PSR contains its own reason for being within itself. It's perfect and self-contained. And that's why I call this the perfection and impossibility proof. It's perfect, self-contained, all that is, all that can be, all that must be, with impossibility being impossible, and non-existence being an impossibility. So why is there existence rather than non-existence? Because non-existence is literally impossible, and existence is possible. Existence is reason. See, that's the important thing to understand. It's not like there's this thing called existence, and then there is also reason. Existence is reason. Existence is existence, and we have labeled it. We have called it reason. Existence is reason and must exist because it is impossible for it to not exist. Its non-existence entails logical contradiction. That's right. So to say non-existence exists, that's a contradiction. As well as if you say existence does not exist. That's also a contradiction. That which exists does not exist. Existence exists. Non-existence does not exist. That which does not exist does not exist. That which exists exists. It's really very, very simple. But I know, not saying you guys specifically, but I know a lot of people will have a hard time with this because you're at the very boundary of thought and people aren't used to thinking in this way. But this is the answer. If one can cognitively truly understand the weight and gravity importance of what is being said. It is the all that is, the I am that I am, the whatever, the absolute, whatever you want to call it. The principle of sufficient reason. For everything that exists, there is a sufficient reason for why it is thus and not otherwise. You try and get rid of that, you wouldn't have non-existence. You would have utter impossibility, which is impossible. And so the PSR must be, and non-existence is impossible. So the answer is simple, beautiful, elegant, and perfect. Yet it's so complex because it sits at the very boundary of thought. This is why the question of existence has perplexed humanity for thousands of years. But this is the answer. So, like I said, I've been talking about this for a while now. And because there's so much to it, it's simple yet complex, like I have said many times by now. And so I want to make the caveat. I was planning on saving this until I released the book, because I want to, make sure that it's well written, well presented, and there's an entire section on it. It's very long. To do so in the space of a live stream is very difficult. So yeah, I want to make that caveat that this is done to, laid out to the best that I can. And, we are live. So if I may have, stumbled over my words and actually, accidentally said, used a word incorrectly, that happens when you live stream. And when you're dealing with things like contradiction and logic and whatnot, that's easy to do. And if one is just, talking quickly. So what I mean by this is, I didn't want to live stream about this because it's something that's really important. It's like trying to do a mathematical proof live or something. Like, yeah, you can do it, but it's much better presented, written, when you can go over it many times, make sure that all the examples are there, make sure it's well explained, make sure all the analogies are great. But this is so important. And I don't know when the book is going to come out, but this is so important. Like I said, I've been seeing people ask this question over and over and over again the past couple months. And it's not like there isn't an answer. There are those 3 answers that I put forward, and there's nothing wrong with those answers. Those are great answers. However, this is the one that I personally prefer and I find very satisfactory, because it shows the utter impossibility of non-existence and the absolutely mandatory fact, or the mandatory state of affairs, being that our existence is mandatory, that we must be and can't not be. It's not even that, this is the thing. It's not even that it's possible for us to exist. It's not even just that we're possible for it to exist. It's that if we didn't exist, our non-existence is a contradiction. So we must exist. We must. There's no way out of it. And anyway, I think I've gone on long enough. But yeah, if you get this and understand this, that's awesome, because it is simple in a certain way. If you don't feel bad, because it's also extremely complex and at the very boundary of thought in another way. And if you haven't, I encourage you to watch this a few times, because this is extremely important. Like I said, this is maybe one of the most important videos that I've ever done. And when you truly grasp it and understand it, you get why we are here. You get that, we are the all that is. And this is what we're doing right now. And you can begin to recognize each other. And when that understanding is promulgated and a sufficient amount of, people start to reach hyper awareness, at least like a leadership, we can construct a brilliant new society, a purposeful teleocratic society where we are engaged in thriving and living and actualizing and growing, rather than the bullshit that we have right now. The bullshit that we have right now, again, it's going to look like tribal, or like not tribal, but like, what's the word? Like hunter-gatherer, primitive, what we had before civilization. It will be so much grander. And all the hate, war, bloodshed, racism, genderism, homophobia, all the attacks on people's rights, all the rights that we're losing, all this religious fanaticism, all that will begin to melt away as we understand what we are. And then like we can finally start to enjoy life. That's the whole thing. We've come to this point, and we're at that phase change. We're at that inflection point where we're going from survival to thriving. Life doesn't have to be about survival anymore. We're here. We got the avatars. The avatars are evolved. We have the cognitive capacity. We have the playing field. We have the localized environment. Now we can start to do the enjoyable part of life, the fun part of life, the great part of life. It's not there right now because humans are still stuck in a survival mindset. A survival mindset of division, of me against you, my family, my nation, my God, my flag, my religion. because that was that you know, having a group identity was important for survival. You had to, you know, have groups to survive. And so that was a very important part of survival. But we don't have to do that anymore. We're at a new phase. Humanity is still stuck in survival mode. We don't have to do that anymore. We're past that. We don't. That's the thing. It's ridiculous. Humans are still stuck in survival mode and killing each other because of it. But they don't have to be. We're past it. We got to the place where we were trying to go, but humans haven't realized that yet, and so are still stuck in the mindset of killing one another. When we have the avatars have developed. We have developed the capacity for self-awareness. We have developed the capacity for hyper-awareness. We have these vehicles for a localized space-time environment. We're here. Evolution did its job. We have evolved to this. We don't have to be nation against nation, people against people, race against race, gender against gender. We don't need that. And as soon as humanity we can have a better world as soon as humanity updates their mental operating system and just realizes, hey, guess what? Here's a crazy idea. You don't have to kill each other. I know, wild, right? Utopian, pipe dream. But we don't. And it's kind of ridiculous that I have to say that. I wake up every morning flabbergasted in like utter disbelief in this shit show of a world, in that it has to be pointed out that we don't have to kill each other. But anyway, that's the world that we have found ourselves in, because the humanity is still stuck in that survival mode, and they think they're very evolved in their suits and their ties, talking about the GDP and the economy. Fuck all that bullshit. Let's build a new purposeful society where we are coming together and learning and growing and understanding and actualizing together. And we can do this. It starts in the mind. As long as you know that it can be done and then help us work towards us, by our will, it will be done. All right, my friends. I am going to take a look at the comments now, because I imagine there may be questions about this, but I hope you enjoyed this. If there are a lot of questions, I may do another video about this because it's such an important topic. If you enjoy my work, consider supporting on Patreon. It helps out a lot. And the link should pop up right over here. At some point, and you get access to our weekly secret live streams, our hidden Discord server, the Citadel, a lot more. And if you've ever felt like you've learned something or gotten something from my work, please consider supporting. It helps out. It allows me to do all this and have a roof over my head and everything, and I appreciate it. And if you choose all the cheapest options, you know, it's really not that much at all. And it helps out a lot. I want to give a shout out to our top supporters: Renaissance Fairy, Cassidy, Michael, Angela, Maria, High Expectations Counseling, Jordy, Svetlin, Nicole, Top of the World, and everyone else. If I haven't put your name up yet, I will do so by Monday. Make sure you check out my playlists and other videos. Thank you very much, my friends. I appreciate it.